shaky ground over his misuse of planes on the job. This source says the president is angry, calling Secretary Price's decisions as, his word, stupid. And we're now learning exactly how much money in terms of taxpayer dollars some of Secretary Price's air travel cost. So when you do the math, it actually tallies to about $1 million, which includes 24 chartered flights, with the biggest payout for 2 international flights on government planes. Price says he will pay back some of the charges. That's closer to $52,000. And yet, as he tries to make up for all of this, the health secretary defended the flights, saying they were all properly vetted.
We think it's important to do a number of things. One is to say there will be no private air charters at HHS going forward. A second is to cooperate fully, obviously, with the Inspector General. There's a review going on, and then I called for an internal review within the department itself, and then finally to pay for my portion of those trips. This is unprecedented. Never been done, to our understanding, before by a secretary, in spite of the fact that previous administrations have had secretaries that flew an awful lot. I work at the pleasure of the president. The president is a remarkable leader. I'm incredibly privileged to serve in his cabinet and work on behalf of the American people. And I look forward to regaining the trust that the American people, some of the American people, may have lost in the activities that I took, and to not only regain the trust of the American people, but gain the trust of the administration and the president.
With me now, CNN senior political commentator David Axelrod, host of the Axe Files. He was also a former senior advisor in the Obama White House. As always, David Axelrod, a pleasure. Welcome.
Hey, Brooke.
I just did the whole setup. Do you think Tom Price should be fired?
Well, look, if I were advising the president as a political matter, absolutely he should be fired, because this is something everybody can relate to. I mean, he clearly abused taxpayer dollars. It was interesting to hear him now take credit for the steps that he's taking in response to his own abuses. You know, the arsonist who dumps fire all over the house, lights the match, and then shows up with a hose and wants credit for retarding the fire. The fact of the matter is that what he did was outrageous. And let me just say, I had a conversation this morning with a former Obama administration cabinet member who told me how difficult it was to get a military airplane. And the only way you could get it was if you could prove that there was no other way to make the trip but this. Now, his staff followed him on these trips on commercial flights. So if his staff could take commercial flights, why did he have to have a military plane? So yes, I would say he should be fired. If this were another administration, he would have been fired already, and Congress would be even more incensed than they apparently are now.
Yeah, and to go with your arsonist, analogy, and the fact that he's showing up with the hose is apparently even further enraging the president. That's according to reporting. But, he's not the only one. There are these 4 Trump cabinet members that are all under fire for their use of private or military jets. Is this a, drunk with power situation, tone-deaf millionaires? I mean, obviously this goes against the whole Trump drain the swamp brand.
Yeah, I think it's a little of all of it, but let's be honest about this. There hasn't exactly been a high ethical standard set from the top. I mean, the president, from not releasing his tax returns to waiving ethics rules, now lobbyists, for example, are being able to donate for the legal defense of people in the White House without disclosure of these. That is a rule that I don't know if it's in effect. It was being considered. A whole range of issues have come up relative to the president and the White House. So if you're a cabinet member, the message that you hear is, the old rules don't apply, and Katie, bar the doors. And I think that if you're gonna demand high ethical standards from your cabinet, then you ought to observe them yourself.
Let's switch to Puerto Rico. I don't know if you were just listening to my Rosie Perez interview. I mean, we went to commercial break, and she was just in full tears, and all I could do was just grab her hand. I mean, she's sad, she's angry, and she is, that's emblematic of so many Americans. And when you look at the president, And, you know, he's almost like he's obsessed with the criticism and the media coverage of how he and the federal government has responded, you know, instead of actually fixing the crisis. Now, Elaine Duke is there today, and there are 10,000 troops on the ground, but what do you make of it?
Well, first of all, let's separate out the people who are on the ground and are trying to do their best from the way the president and the administration has reacted to it. We spent a whole weekend where the entire focus of the president was on Colin Kaepernick and a story that took place a long time ago, and he decided that he wanted to score some political points with his base, and that was where his focus was over the weekend while this massive humanitarian crisis was welling up. But there's another issue here, and that is the president's apparent inability to show any kind of empathy. Anyone who watches these scenes from Puerto Rico hears stories about people dying because the power ran out on their dialysis machine, or people who can't get their medication, and people cut off and fearful. Anyone would be moved by these stories, and he seems intent on proving that he's doing a good job, that he responded adequately. And so now I'm reminded of the mistake, frankly, that President Bush made during Hurricane Katrina when he said, "You're doing a heck of a job, Brownie," to his FEMA director, when plainly there were big problems. So, you know, and you should take a lesson from that. But I think this is more endemic to who the man is. He's so absorbed with himself that it is hard for him to get beyond that and put himself in other people's shoes. And that is part of the job of the president, is to make that human connection, to signify to people that you are thoroughly invested in trying to deal with the crisis they're facing, that you hear them, that you feel them. And that also permeates the rest of the government in responding to the crisis. So it's a problem, and I don't know if this is one that he can overcome in terms of his own personality.
He heads to Puerto Rico Tuesday. We will watch and wait and see. You're right, though, on how much time and Twitter characters, you know, he gave to the whole NFL protest bit. And you talked to the legendary James Baker, who actually backed the president's argument on these national anthem protests. Here's just a piece of your conversation with him.
I just think it's outrageous. There are plenty of ways that you can call into question some of the racism that may still exist in this country, but that's the wrong way to do it. You don't denigrate. The one thing that used to, and I hope it still will, unify us is that we're all Americans.
Colin Kaepernick was expressing a sentiment that many people in the community feel about injustice, about the problems within our criminal justice system that are deeply felt, and he drew attention to them. He made clear that he wasn't protesting the military, the flag. He was exercising the rights that the flag
You can't
offered.
tell me that not standing up for the national anthem with your hand over your heart is not denigrating the national anthem with the flag. It is.
I mean, the players stood up last night during the anthem. You think the president's winning on this one?
Well, I don't know whether he's winning or not. I don't know that dividing the country. CNN has a poll out today that suggests the country's deeply divided on this issue. This was an unnecessary debate that he inserted into the national discussion, again, reinserted it in order to score political points. So whether he's on the sort of 52% or 48% or whatever side of this issue, I don't think the country gains, and therefore I don't think he gains ultimately by engaging in this, and certainly at a time when there are other issues like Puerto Rico that are really pressing and demand and deserve his attention. Interesting thing about Secretary Baker on this was, in many other points in the interview, he was tacitly very critical of the president on the tweeting, on some of his personnel practices and so on. And so I think he was all too happy to wade into this one to just you know, put a few chips on the other side. But it's really, I hope people will watch this discussion tomorrow night because this is a guy who was considered one of the great White House chiefs of staff, one of the great kind of government insiders in the history, or certainly in modern history. And the president would be well to watch this, because he offered some points that would be really useful.
Mr. President, tune in if you're watching. It's the Axe Files. Don't miss this full interview with legendary statesman and former Secretary of State James Baker. As David mentioned, the Axe Files airs tomorrow night, 7 o'clock Eastern, only here on CNN. David Axelrod, always a pleasure. Thank you.
Same here.
And next, thank you. And what David just mentioned, a newly released CNN poll shows where the country stands on these NFL protests and President Trump's reaction to them. And I've got Montel Williams waiting in the wings here. He's going to weigh in, Marine, why the military veteran has been passionately defending